Hello everyone, how are things going? So this is my FAQ about our favorite mustache superhero, Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm going to start by saying I love the response papers. I think you guys did an awesome job. Really interesting interpretations of the text, really good questions. I can't answer them all, obviously, but so I just basically picked the ones that I thought would be most useful. And I thought this was an incredibly important exercise. I mean, I got a good sense of like how you were reading the text and what kind of struggles you were having, and I feel like we're engaging in some sort of dialogue, at least as much as possible with an asynchronous class, right? And so I'm probably going to run the response papers like this from now on. I thought it was really useful for me, and I think the answers I give here are going to be useful for you too, right? So let me go through it. Let me give you kind of a sketchy answer to each of these questions. I'll do the best I can. So Raina asked, what's the best way to dissect these readings? I get overwhelmed by the vocabulary and language used, so any advice would be great. And let me just make this clear. Some of the readings we're going to do in class are just going to be really difficult. This Nietzsche reading is a good example. I think the Michel Foucault one that's coming up a little later might even be more challenging, right? And here's the thing, right? If you're feeling confused, you're in good company because a lot of people feel confused when they read these texts the first time. In fact, people spend their entire lives studying Nietzsche's work partially to clear up some of the confusions that come up in the text, right? So what I would recommend, if you run into a passage that you find really confusing, don't let yourself get burdened by it, right? Move past that and focus on the things that do make sense, right? Because with any difficult text, there's going to be little moments of light, little things that the author says that make sense to you. Grab onto those and try to figure out what's going on with those passages, right? And then the hope is that the more you return to the text, the more you read, the more it's going to become clear as time moves on, right? And so that's one of my big pieces of advice. Don't let yourself get stuck in a passage that you find really difficult. Another thing is to be aware that Nietzsche and Foucault too, they play around with concepts. They take words that we're familiar with and they do new things with them. And so you got to be really pay attention to some of these concepts that they work with. So when Nietzsche's talking about truth and lies, he's doing new things with truth and lies. What he ends up when he starts talking about these terms are completely different than we usually associate with them, right? And so you got to just kind of roll with it, right? You see what he's doing with this and see how useful you find it, right? So I don't have easy answers to that, but I think those are the two pieces of advice that I think will be helpful, right? Now, Ravine asks, are there perhaps examples of the sorts of people that Nietzsche would consider to be those of reason or intuition? So he's looking at the man of reason and the man of intuition, that section that he's talking about at the end, right? Well, you are in luck, Ravine, because Nietzsche told us basically what he thought about every major philosopher that lived in his contemporary time period, right? If you're curious about this, where you can find this is actually my favorite Nietzsche book, which is Twilight of the Idols, right? Which is really fun. It's filled with aphorisms and short little comments he has about people and stuff like that. And so we can get kind of a sense of the people that he respected and admired and the people that he didn't, right? On top of the list of the people that he admired were Ralph Waldo Emerson, right? And I think it's unquestionable that he thinks he would be a person of intuition. And when you read Ralph Emerson and Nietzsche's works, you see like a lot of connections between them. They both do the thing where they take terms that we're all familiar with and sort of play around with it and make it mean new and interesting things. And so you got to be like real careful when you're reading his text, right? One person that he hated with a passion or seemed to have a very low opinion of is John Stuart Mill, right? Who's the founder of utilitarianism, that way of thinking about morality and so on and so forth, right? So if you're curious, that's where you can find answers to some of those questions, right? But I think what's going to be more helpful is thinking of contemporary examples, right? And I don't think it's useful to divide this between scientists and everybody else, right? I think he had in the mind scientists as being the person of reason and artists being the people of intuition. But that's not exactly what he means, right? I think he thinks a scientist could be a person of intuition too, right? And so if you're thinking of a person of reason that's currently in our media, I would think Anthony Fauci would be a good example, right? The person who's the pandemic expert at the CDC, right? Really smart guy. What he believes is really useful. We need him to be there. There's no question about that. But Fauci probably didn't revolutionize our understanding of disease and how it works, right? He's more just doing the best he can to reveal the information that he thinks we have available, right? While someone who I think you would consider like a person of intuition might be someone like Albert Einstein, right? So someone who, or Watson and Crick, people that revolutionized our understanding of something by looking at something in a new way or introducing new sets of concepts, taking what we already knew and sort of reassembling it in new combinations, right? So if that helps, I think that's a good sort of distinction there, right? Anthony Fauci would be more the person of reason, and Albert Einstein might be more the person of intuition, I think, right? Jason asks, what does Nietzsche's study and the origins of the will to truth mean for us? What should we do about it? And I remember I took a post-colonial literature class once, and that was continually my question. So what do we do with all this information, right? And so I think his view of truth as being truth as being more about what effect it has on people, and the reason we accept a certain belief having more to do with the effect it has on us, whether it be a beneficial or not beneficial effect or whatever, versus its absolute truthness, I think is a really important observation, and it comes into play in a lot of discussions, and I think in contemporary society. One really good example is when we're trying to combat misinformation, particularly about scientific concepts, right? So there's a body of theory that argues that the way we get people to believe in things like climate change or vaccination or whatever is we tell them the facts, right? We explain to them what the truth is about the matter, right? And once they understand that, they should just naturally believe the thing, right? And of course, it's more complicated than that, right? That when we start looking at how to convince people of to vaccinate their children or whatever, we see that their belief systems come into play, their cultural background, their religion, all this stuff, is important, right? And so if we want to convince those people, we need to take that stuff into account. We need to take into account their cultural background, right? And so I think it's really important, this observation that even if we do believe in some kind of truth, unlike Nietzsche, right? This observation that the effect it has on us personally, the effect it has on our cultural group, so on and so forth, is more important than the actual truth of the matter, I think is something that's been borne out in research we've done on persuasion and so on and so forth. Hopefully that made sense, right? So that's one big area where this is important. When you're thinking about how to convince somebody of an argument, right? Giving them the facts probably isn't going to be enough, right? You're going to have to think about where they're coming from and figure out how to play into to their belief system in some way, right? Rebecca asks, so she's curious about the science stuff at the end of the book, right? At the end of the chapter that we read. And then she goes on to talk about the battle between the man and reason and man of intuition, and how this relates to science and the transformation from intellect into intuition. Now, once again, I think it's important that while Nietzsche thinks of science as more related to reason, and he thinks of art as more related to intuition, I don't think he's necessarily saying scientists can't be people of intuition. They can't be the kind of people that sort of disrupt concepts and get us to think about things in new ways, right? When he's describing science and what he thinks the science does, right, it's hard to figure out exactly what he's saying, right? He makes an allusion to bees and how they fill up the honeycombs with honey and stuff like that. He talks about architecture and how they sort of build, structures upon top of existing structures and so on and so forth. And I think what he has in mind is that he views science's normal operation as seeking to sort of resolve contradictions and conflicts that occur between ideas and concepts that we have, right? And so rather than discovering new things about the world, right, it's mostly taking our existing understanding of the world and kind of cleaning it up, like figuring out how to resolve a contradiction that might exist, bringing things into alignment with each other, and so on and so forth. And if you think this is kind of weird, this idea isn't that far from our good friend Thomas Kuhn, right? Who came around, good 60 or 70 years after Nietzsche died, right? But Kuhn has this idea that what science typically does is what he calls normal science, right? And normal science, what it does is it goes through and sort of solves puzzles that scientists still have, replicates studies to make sure things are consistent with each other, and so on and so forth, right? So he has this idea that the typical behavior of science is what he calls puzzle solving, more than anything else, right? And so I think that's kind of what he's trying to get at here. I think he has a very similar idea of the way science normally works, right? Now, Kuhn also says that there are times when science engages in what he calls paradigm shifts, right? Where people shift to a new way of thinking on a particular subject, right? And I think that's where our person of intuition starts to come into play, where they're challenging that existing framework rather than just sort of building and resolving conflicts with it and so on and so forth, right? And finally, Cassidy's got a really fun question, right? And so she asks, how can Nietzsche justify his own paper based on his conception that we cannot discover truth through our language, right? And I think the reason I introduced this one last is because I think it prepares us really well for what we're going to talk about in the next video, right? And the answer to that is Nietzsche certainly doesn't think that you should accept his worldview because it's the truth, right? That's not the argument that he would make, right? So he doesn't think that he's discovered the objective truth, right, while other people have not, right? He thinks that rather you should judge the truth or falsity of his view based on how we judge the truth or falsity of everything, right? Basically the consequences that particular worldview has. Like, what can we do with it? What effect does it have on human life? So on and so forth, right? So if it's leads to good outcomes, right? So if it has good consequences, right? I think maybe you want to think about adopting this particular view, at least in his mind, right? If it has bad consequences, right? If it makes life more difficult or prevents us from solving problems or whatever, however you want to define that, right? Then you should adopt it. Then you should not adopt it, right? And so basically, I think Nietzsche would say something like this: why don't you try it out? Put on this way of thinking, put on this hat, right? And see what it lets you, what it reveals about the world around you, right? And if you find that it reveals interesting, useful things, then go with it, right? This might be a worldview that might be interesting and relevant, right? But if it doesn't, if it's counterproductive for whatever reason, then you probably should get rid of it, right? So hopefully that helps out. It helps explain that, right? So I don't think, and there's a section where Nietzsche talks about this too, but I don't think that he would say that you should believe it because it is the objective truth, right? I think he describes that in his text as another form of dogmatism, right? Anyway, so do with this what you will. If you have any other questions, just let me know. I will be meeting with the learning communities this week, and so hopefully if you have additional questions, you can go ahead and ask then.